A
We're at the
woman's
gas
hand
station
trembles
now.
as she dials
Initial
911
assessment
at a gas
suggests the
station.
tire was deliberately tampered with.
Blue and red
We need
lights flood the
forensics here
frame.
immediately.
A police officer steps toward another woman, not with handcuffs, but with a salute. The caller watches from her car, her face crumpling. A voice whispers over the chaos, she was supposed to be the victim. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when Marcus pulled the Lexus into the Shell station on Birch Street. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that felt like every other Tuesday morning in the past 5 years of their marriage, except it wasn't. He didn't know it yet, but the next 40 minutes would become the hinge upon which everything turned. "I'll grab coffee," Sarah said, unbuckling her seatbelt. She wore the cream-colored blazer he loved, the one that made her look sharp and capable, exactly how she presented herself at work. Senior accountant. Meticulous. Trusted. She had a 9 a.m. meeting with a major client about an audit. She was going to be late if they didn't hurry. Marcus nodded, focusing on the pump display. He'd been distant this morning, nothing Sarah had done or failed to do, but something he carried inside himself, a heaviness that had been accumulating for months. He was a physical therapist, and he spent his days helping people recover from trauma, but he couldn't seem to fix what was breaking in his own marriage. The passion had dimmed to something practical. They were a well-oiled machine, and well-oiled machines didn't spark. He didn't notice when Sarah's gait changed as she walked toward the station. He didn't see how her face had shifted from hurry to something else entirely. He was too focused on the pump, on the routine, on being present in the way he thought a good husband should be. Inside the station, Karen was having a different kind of morning. She'd been standing in the small convenience store for 3 minutes, staring at the same row of energy drinks, unable to decide. Not because the choice was difficult, but because making any choice at all felt impossible right now. She'd been fired that morning. Not laid off, not let go as part of restructuring. Fired. With cause. The cause being insubordination, which was corporate speak for, she talked back to the wrong man. Karen was 42 years old and had just lost the job that had paid for her apartment, her car payment, and the life she'd constructed with painstaking care over the past 7 years. She'd been in that job since the divorce. Since her ex-husband had taken most of what she had in the settlement because she hadn't fought back hard enough. Because she'd been too tired. Because she'd believed, for too long, that if she was just cooperative enough, kind enough, small enough, people would do right by her. Sarah headed straight for the coffee station, her mind already spinning through the numbers she'd need to review this morning. The client was difficult, a property management company with sloppy records going back 3 years. It would be painstaking work, but that was what Sarah did. She found clarity in chaos. That was her gift. That was also why Marcus had slowly begun to feel like he was disappearing in their marriage. Sarah was so focused on solving problems, on fixing things, that sometimes he wondered if he was just another problem to her. Something to be optimized. She was pouring her coffee when Karen walked over to the counter, standing behind her with the kind of positioning that would seem innocuous to any observer. Sarah turned to go, and their shoulders nearly collided. "Oh, excuse me," Sarah said, her corporate training kicking in immediately. Polite. Professional. A split-second smile that didn't reach her eyes because she was already mentally back in her car, back on the highway, back at her desk. "No problem," Karen said quietly. But something in the way she said it, a flatness, a desperation poorly concealed, made Sarah glance back. Sarah had always been sensitive to people in crisis. That was the irony of her distant marriage. She could read a stranger's pain in their voice. She just couldn't seem to understand her own husband's. "You okay?" Sarah asked, and she meant it. The words had genuinely stopped her. Karen felt something crack inside her chest. This stranger's simple question, asked without judgment, broke something open that she'd been holding together all morning. "Just a bad day," Karen said, and then, because there was something in this woman's face that suggested genuine care, she added quietly, "Lost my job today. This morning." Walked in, did nothing different than I've done for 7 years, and they called me into an office and escorted me out. Said I was a problem. Said I didn't fit the culture. Sarah set down her coffee cup. She forgot about her 9 a.m. meeting for the first time in 5 years. Without thinking, she reached out and touched Karen's arm. "That's brutal," Sarah said. "I'm so sorry. For what it's worth, whatever happened, that says something about them, not you." Karen's eyes glistened. "I don't know if I believe that anymore." Sarah saw something of herself in those words. She saw the moment when you stop believing you're worth fighting for. She'd been that person once, right after college, in the aftermath of a relationship that had nearly destroyed her. She'd clawed her way back to believing she mattered. But somewhere in building her life with Marcus, in becoming competent and reliable and the steady one, she'd started to disappear again. "You will," Sarah said. "I'm sorry you're going through this." For just a moment, they were connected, two women holding a thread of understanding across the distance between them. It was ordinary and extraordinary. The kind of moment that happens thousands of times a day, unnoticed. Karen nodded, swallowed hard. "Thank you for stopping. For seeing me." Sarah squeezed her arm once more, picked up her coffee, and walked back out to the car. She never would see Karen's face again. But Karen would see Sarah's face many times in the coming days. She would carry it with her. She would reshape it in her mind, reconfigure it, use it as a mirror to see herself not as the woman who'd been fired, but as someone who'd been wronged. Marcus was scrolling through his phone when Sarah got back to the car. When she settled into the passenger seat, he asked, "Grabbing anything?" "Just got coffee," she said. He looked at her for a moment, this woman he'd loved for 5 years and was slowly learning not to recognize. In the morning light, her face looked drawn. "You look tired." "I feel tired," she said, which was honest in a way she rarely permitted herself with him. "Maybe after your meeting," he offered. "We could do something tonight. Order from that Thai place you like. Actually talk." It was an overture. An attempt at connection. Sarah heard it as such, and she turned to him with a smile that was almost sad. "I'd like that," she said. He drove her downtown, and she thought about the woman at the gas station, about how sometimes the smallest kindnesses could seem like miracles when you were drowning. She wondered what would happen to her, that woman with the desperately sad eyes. She hoped she'd be okay. She would never know how wrong that hope was. She would never know that Karen was following their car's license plate number on her phone at that very moment, using an app she'd downloaded 6 months ago for no reason she could fully articulate. She'd typed it in almost as a reflex, and now she had information, registered to Marcus Chen and Sarah Chen. Married filing jointly. Address in the suburbs. Karen sat in her own car in the Shell station parking lot, her hands shaking with something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite desperation. It was the chemical cocktail of a person whose life had just collapsed, now fixated on a moment of kindness from a stranger as proof that not everything was corrupt. That people could be good. Or that's what she told herself. The truth was more complicated. Karen had a pattern. She'd always had a pattern. She'd been fired from her last job 2 years before this one. And the one before that. Never for the same reason, always some variation of personality conflict, attitude problem, insubordination. She'd begun to suspect it was her. Then she'd stopped suspecting and started believing it was everyone else. In her apartment, there were notebooks. Dozens of them. Names written inside. Incidents catalogued. Perceived slights meticulously preserved in case she ever needed to prove she'd been wronged. Sarah Chen's name was written in there now, along with the license plate number, the time, 7:47 a.m., and what Sarah had said, "You will believe you matter again." Karen had rephrased it in her own mind, "This woman understood something about my suffering that I need to remember." It was a small step from memory to ownership. From ownership to responsibility. Karen would tell herself that she was simply making sure Sarah didn't forget their connection. That she was making sure someone in this world saw her pain and remembered it. But something darker was already beginning to bloom in Karen's thinking. She'd been forced out of her life. She'd been dismissed, discarded, undervalued. And here was this woman with the good job, the good car, the good marriage, she'd imagined this based on no evidence at all, who had given her a moment of pity wrapped in words. Pity. That's what it had been. Karen began to reframe it. Not kindness. Pity. The kind of pity that implied Sarah was better. That Sarah had figured it out. That Sarah was someone who helped others from her position of superiority. Karen sat in her car and felt the moment shift inside her. She felt it clearly. She felt the moment when she decided that this woman was going to understand what it meant to fall the way Karen had fallen. And that Sarah would somehow, through whatever means necessary, become the instrument of that understanding. By 8:15 a.m., Karen had made a decision. She drove toward the downtown area where Sarah's office building was located. She waited in the parking garage. And when she saw Sarah walking toward the building at 8:47 a.m., coffee in hand, blazer perfect, she made a phone call. 911, what's your emergency? Karen's voice, when she spoke, was steady. Practiced, almost. As if she'd been rehearsing this moment even while it was still just a thought. Yes, I need to report a serious situation. I'm at the professional building on Merchant Street. There's a woman here, I just witnessed her trying to get into someone's car. She looked very unstable, and I think she's planning to hurt someone. She was muttering about revenge. Her name is Sarah Chen. She's wearing a cream blazer. She's walking toward the building right now. Please, I'm frightened. The 911 operator asked standard questions. Karen answered with the kind of specificity that sounded credible. The shaking in her voice was real, it was the shaking of someone whose plan was actually working, whose pain was about to become someone else's problem. By 8:52 a.m., dispatch had the description. By 8:54 a.m., officers were en route. By 8:55 a.m., Sarah was walking into her office building, completely unaware that her morning had just been rerouted toward a collision with another woman's broken heart. She took the elevator to the 4th floor. She set her coffee down at her desk. She opened her email to review the audit materials for her 9 a.m. meeting. She was smiling. She was thinking about the overture Marcus had made. She was allowing herself to imagine that maybe they could fix things. That maybe the distance between them was something they could close. She was thinking about this when her office door opened and 2 police officers stood in the frame, their faces serious, their hands near their belts. Sarah Chen, the first officer asked. Sarah looked up, confused. Yes. What? We've received a report of threatening behavior. We need you to come with us to answer some questions. I'm sorry, what? Sarah's brain scrambled for purchase on what was happening. There must be some kind of mistake. I don't know what you're talking about. We have a witness report that you were acting suspiciously in the parking garage. Potentially planning to harm someone. We need you to cooperate. Sarah stood up, her hands raised instinctively. I was just arriving at work. I came from home. I stopped at a gas station for coffee. That's it. There's definitely been a misunderstanding. The officers exchanged a glance. One of them spoke into his radio. We have the subject in her office. She's cooperating. They were professional, not rough. But they were certain, in the way police are when they have a report and they're going to follow protocol. They didn't touch her, but they moved her toward the door with the kind of inevitable momentum that felt like arrest even though no words of arrest had been spoken. This is insane, Sarah heard herself saying. I want to call my husband. I want to call a lawyer. You can make a call from the station, the first officer said. Let's go. As they walked through the office, her colleagues watched. Sarah saw the confusion on their faces, and then, after they processed what was happening, she saw the judgment. The suspicion. The way people's faces changed when someone they worked with suddenly became a possible threat. In the parking garage, she saw Karen standing near the entrance to the building. Karen was holding a tissue to her face, as if she'd been crying. When she saw Sarah being escorted by police, she made a small sound, a gasp of fear, and took a step back. Sarah locked eyes with her for just a moment, and something cold moved through her chest. The woman from the gas station. The woman she'd shown kindness to. The woman whose pain she'd recognized and tried to soothe. Sarah's mouth opened. She wanted to say something, to ask what was happening, to explain that this woman had misunderstood something, but the officers kept moving her forward. "Don't come near me," Karen said loudly, her voice shaking with what sounded like genuine terror. "Please. Just take her away." Sarah was placed in the back of a police car. The door closed with a sound like finality. Through the window, she could see Karen being comforted by a concerned building security guard. She could see other employees coming out to watch. And then the car was moving, and Marcus's phone was ringing, and Sarah was trying to explain to a voice on the other end of the line that she didn't understand what was happening, that she'd been at the gas station, that she'd gone to work, that she'd done nothing wrong. Behind them, Karen sat in her own car and felt the weight lift. Someone else was falling now. Someone else was experiencing the disorientation of being accused of something they didn't do, the terror of having their life suddenly questioned. Someone else was drowning. The police station held the fluorescent beige aesthetic of every institutional building designed to make time feel suspended. Sarah sat in an interrogation room, they called it an interview room, but the fluorescent light and the metal table and the single door made the distinction semantic, and tried to construct a logical explanation for her presence here. Detective Raymond Morrison sat across from her, a man in his mid-50s with the kind of face that had seen enough of human nature to be permanently skeptical of explanations. "Walk me through your morning again," he said, his voice not unkind, but not sympathetic either. "Starting from when you woke up." Sarah had already walked him through it twice. But she understood the process. She was being checked for inconsistencies. They would ask again and again until her story either solidified or fractured. "I woke up at 6:30. I showered. I got dressed. I had breakfast with my husband. He drove me to a Shell station on Birch Street around 7:40. I went inside, got coffee. I was back in the car by 7:55. He drove me to the downtown office building. I arrived at 8:47. I went to my office. That's when you were waiting for me. And at the gas station, you had contact with another woman?" "Yes. I mean, we were both getting coffee. We had a brief conversation." "What did you talk about?" Sarah hesitated. It felt wrong to talk about Karen's pain to a police detective. It felt like a betrayal of the vulnerability that Karen had shared. She said she'd lost her job. I offered some encouragement. That's all. A 2-minute conversation. Detective Morrison leaned back in his chair. "The woman who called in the report says you were acting oddly. Looking at her intently. Making her uncomfortable." "That's not," Sarah started, then stopped. How could she explain that she'd seen pain and tried to acknowledge it? How could she explain that her kindness was being weaponized against her? "I was being nice. I felt bad for her. She says you were memorizing details about her. That she got a bad feeling. That she thought you might be fixated on her. That's crazy. I was trying to be kind. I've never seen that woman before in my life." "And you never interacted with her after that? At the office building?" "No. I went straight to my office." Morrison studied her for a long moment. "You know what makes my job hard, Ms. Chen? It's that most accusations are made by someone with a genuine concern. People don't usually lie to police. It's risky. It's a crime to file a false report. So when someone calls in with specifics about a concerning individual, I have to take it seriously. I have to investigate. Then investigate, Sarah said, and her voice had begun to shake. Check your security cameras. Check the parking garage footage. You'll see I came straight from my car. I didn't approach anyone. I wasn't acting oddly. Morrison made a note. Your company does have security cameras. I've already requested the footage. We'll see what it shows. What it would show, Sarah knew, was nothing. She would walk from the parking garage to the elevator. She would not approach anyone. She would appear completely normal. This knowledge should have calmed her, but instead it terrified her. Because if the evidence was going to exonerate her, then nothing had actually happened. And if nothing had actually happened, that meant she'd been accused of nothing. That she'd been arrested, or close enough to arrested, on completely false pretenses. I want my husband, she said. I want a lawyer. You can make that call, Morrison said. But I'd advise you to stay calm. These things often have simple explanations. The caller might have misunderstood something. The cameras might show she was confused. This could all be cleared up today. But even as he said it, Sarah could see in his expression that he didn't believe it. He was looking at her with the kind of polite distrust that police develop toward suspects. She was no longer an innocent person, she was someone who had been accused. And accusations, once made, held a weight that was difficult to overcome. She made 2 phone calls. The first to Marcus, who said he'd call their lawyer and meet her at the station. The second to her supervisor at work, leaving a message that something had come up and she needed to reschedule her 9 a.m. meeting and wouldn't be in the office today. Then she sat in the interrogation room and waited. By 11 a.m., Marcus had arrived with their attorney, a sharp woman named Diane Morse who specialized in criminal defense. She was 62 years old and had seen enough false accusations and miscarriages of justice to have developed a low tolerance for circumstantial nonsense. The footage, she said to Morrison after being briefed, clearly shows my client entering the building, going to her office, and having no contact with anyone. There is no evidence of any crime, no evidence of any threatening behavior, and the only evidence in this case is the accusation of a woman whose credibility is now questionable. We still need to follow up, Morrison said. Verify her employment, check her background. You can do that without keeping her here, Diane said flatly. Unless you're planning to charge her with something specific, you need to let her go. Morrison exchanged a look with his partner. Sarah could see them making a calculation. On one side of the scale, a citizen's report of threatening behavior. On the other side, security footage showing nothing, and a defense attorney who was going to make life difficult if they tried to hold her. You're free to go, Morrison said finally. But we may have follow-up questions. As they walked out of the police station, Sarah felt unmoored. The charges had evaporated, but something in her had changed. She'd experienced the machinery of the law moving against her, and the machinery didn't care if it was right or wrong. It moved on its own momentum, fueled by accusation and protocol. In the car on the way home, Marcus asked, "What in God's name happened?" Sarah couldn't fully articulate it. A woman accused me of acting threatening at my office building. I talked to her at a gas station this morning. She said she'd lost her job. I tried to be kind. And now I'm some kind of suspect. Marcus gripped the steering wheel. Did you know this woman before today? No. It was literally a 2-minute conversation. I'm not even sure what I said that could have been misinterpreted. This is insane, Marcus said. But something in his tone had shifted. He believed her, but he was also processing the reality that his wife had been taken to a police station and interrogated. The reality that she'd been accused of something. Even innocent accusations stain things. Even false allegations left a residue. By the time they got home, Sarah's hands were shaking. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table and tried to breathe through the surreality of it. 2 hours ago, she'd been a normal person. Now she was someone who had been reported to police. Someone who'd been interrogated. Someone whose colleagues were going to ask questions about why she'd been missing from the office on a day with a major client meeting. Marcus sat down across from her and reached for her hand. "This is going to be fine. We'll figure out who this woman is and what her problem is, and if she files anything else, we'll get a restraining order." "But why?" Sarah asked, and the question came out small. "Why would she do this? I was nice to her." Marcus didn't answer because there was no good answer. There was just the random cruelty of broken people who wanted company in their suffering. What Marcus and Sarah didn't know, what they wouldn't know until much later, was that Karen had carefully constructed her false report. She'd used a burner phone registered to a prepaid number. She'd timed the call for when she knew Sarah would be arriving at her office. She'd positioned herself to witness the arrest. And then, when it happened, when police actually showed up and Sarah actually was taken away, Karen felt the first real relief she'd experienced since being fired. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was more like the release of pressure. She'd taken her pain and transmitted it. She'd made someone else understand, even for just a few hours, what it felt like to be accused, to be suspect, to have her life questioned. But the relief was already fading. By noon, Karen was driving her car aimlessly, and already she was thinking, it's not enough. A false accusation that could be easily disproven. It wasn't enough. Sarah had gotten off without real consequences. The damage was temporary, fixable. Karen needed to do something that would stick. Something that would follow Sarah the way her fired status was following Karen. By 1 p.m., she was at a UPS store, printing out documents. By 2 p.m., she was creating an email account using a name she'd chosen randomly. By 3 p.m., she was composing the first message. "Sarah Chen, I have evidence of your threatening behavior toward a coworker at the downtown office building. I'm considering going to the local news with this story. I'm also considering filing a restraining order. Your career is about to become significantly more difficult." She didn't identify herself. She didn't make explicit threats. She was careful to stay on the right side of the law while ensuring maximum damage. Karen had learned from her years of collecting grievances that precision mattered. The laws were there to protect people like Sarah from people like her, so she would simply move more carefully. Sarah received the email at 5 p.m. She was still at home when her phone chimed with the notification. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she called Marcus. "There's an email," she said, her voice hollow. "From someone I don't know. They're threatening to go to the news about today." Marcus came home within 30 minutes. They read the email together, and then they called Diane, who said to forward it to her immediately and not to respond. "This is a criminal matter now," Diane said over the phone. "This is harassment and extortion. The tone changed when they mentioned coercing you. We're going to file a police report and then we're going to trace this email." But by the time they traced it, Karen had already set the account to expire. And by the time they tried to trace the UPS store, the packages had been handled by dozens of people and contained nothing but printed documents purchased with cash. What would become clear, gradually, after much investigation, was that Karen had carefully constructed a narrative and had been feeding it to Sarah piece by piece. The false accusation had been the first move. The threatening email was the second. But Karen was already planning the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. She was going to layer accusations the way she'd layered grievances in her notebooks. She was going to make it impossible for anyone to prove that each individual incident was her doing, but impossible to deny that Sarah's life was being systematically dismantled by someone unknown. 3 weeks after the incident at the office building, Sarah had begun to understand that false accusations didn't resolve themselves. They settled into your life like smoke. You could see through them in certain lights, but they were always there. Her company had been supportive when she brought them the police report showing the security footage. Her boss, Tom, had assured her that it was clearly a misunderstanding and not to worry about it affecting her job. And it hadn't. Not directly. But Sarah had noticed the changes. The way Tom had scheduled the client meeting with someone else instead of her. The way emails that used to be marked high priority were now just FYI. The way her invitations to meetings had become sporadic. It's because people know, she told Marcus one night. Even though they know it was false, they know. And they don't know what to do with that information, so they just treat me differently. You should talk to Tom again, Marcus suggested. Make sure he understands it's completely resolved. But Sarah understood the invisible calculus of workplace social politics well enough to know that talking about it more would only cement the impression. Better to let it fade. Let people forget. Let normalcy return. Except normalcy wasn't returning. 2 weeks ago, someone had posted on a Reddit thread about her company using her name and referencing the false arrest at her office building. The post was from an account that appeared to have been created just to make this one post. Sarah's tech-savvy colleague had found it and brought it to her attention with visible discomfort. It's total bullshit, he'd said. Obviously some troll. But I thought you'd want to know. She did and she didn't. Every piece of information was another angle from which her life could be understood incorrectly. Then there was the incident at the grocery store. Sarah had been picking up groceries after work when she realized someone was taking photos of her with their phone. An older woman, mid-60s, who looked at Sarah with something approaching disgust when Sarah's eyes met hers. Sarah had approached the woman and asked if there was a problem. The woman had said, "I just wanted documentation. You never know when you might need it. My daughter works at an office building downtown. She says there's been an incident." Sarah's hands had started shaking. She'd left her cart in the aisle and walked out. That night, Marcus held her while she cried, and they both understood the same horrible thing simultaneously. The accusation had become real in a way that was separate from the truth. Reality had become optional. What mattered now was the narrative, and the narrative was that Sarah was someone suspect. By this point, Diane had filed an official restraining order against Karen, who was still operating under the radar with her email accounts and anonymous posts. Karen had been careful not to directly contact Sarah, but she'd been operating in the spaces between direct contact, anonymous posts, carefully constructed narratives, anonymous tips. One of these tips had landed on the desk of a journalist at the local paper named David Chen, no relation to Sarah. David was the kind of reporter who still believed in traditional investigation, but he also understood that the most compelling stories were often ones where good people became implicated in ambiguous situations. He'd read the police report. He'd seen the security footage. He'd confirmed that the accusation was false. But he'd also noticed that the accusation had had staying power. He'd decided to investigate why. What he'd discovered, over the course of his reporting, was the email, the Reddit post, the anonymous tips, the woman in the grocery store. He'd traced the threads as far as they would go without revealing his informant. And while he couldn't absolutely prove that one person was behind all of it, the pattern was unmistakable. David had pitched the story to his editor as a feature about how false accusations could create consequences that lasted far longer than the accusation itself. It was a good story, one that would reflect well on the paper. But there was a legal problem. He still couldn't definitively prove who was making the false allegations. And without proof, the story risked being defamation against either Sarah or Karen. So the story was shelved. What didn't get shelved was Karen's campaign, which had evolved by week 3 into something more sophisticated. She'd hired a private investigator, paid for with the last of her savings, to gather information about Sarah. Not anything illegal, just public records, public information, things that could be aggregated into a portrait of someone's life. The private investigator had been confused about why Karen wanted this information. She'd said it was for a custody case. He'd accepted this lie and had moved forward. By the time Diane discovered what Karen was doing, through a combination of financial records and the PI's own guilt, which made him reach out to warn Sarah, Karen had collected over 200 pages of material. Bank records, publicly available through lien searches, property records, court documents, traffic citations, professional licenses. Everything that could be gathered legally was gathered. And then Karen had compiled it into a document titled The Truth About Sarah Chen and had left copies at places Sarah frequented, the gym where she worked out, her dry cleaner, the coffee shop near her office. When Diane saw the documents, she had taken them to Detective Morrison. "This is stalking," she'd said flatly. "This is a clear pattern of harassment and intimidation. Your department has had every opportunity to identify who is making these false reports, and you haven't." Morrison was a good detective, and he was also a detective who was tired of how this case had evolved. What had started as a simple false accusation had turned into something that was making his department look incompetent. He'd filed a report about the stalking. He'd tried to request the private investigator's records. He'd hit walls and procedural delays at every turn. What he didn't yet know was that Karen was already planning the next phase. On a Tuesday evening, Sarah came home to find her house had been broken into. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was vandalized. But someone had been inside. Sarah could feel it immediately, the subtle displacement of objects, the sense that someone had moved through her private space. She called the police immediately, and they came, and they found the signs of forced entry at a basement window. And they found nothing. No clear evidence of theft or vandalism. Just the fact of intrusion. "Sometimes people break in just to establish that they can," the police officer explained. "To let you know they have access. That they can get to you." Marcus held Sarah while she stood in her bedroom and understood the implications. Someone knew where she lived. Someone had been inside their home. Someone was telling her, without words, that they could reach her anywhere. "We're going to install a security system," Marcus said. "We're going to change the locks. We're going to do everything we can to protect you." They did all of these things. But protection against an invisible threat is a type of futility that Sarah was beginning to understand deeply. You can lock doors. You can install cameras. You can take precautions against known risks. But you can't protect yourself against someone who exists in the margins, moving through the spaces between your awareness. By week 4, Sarah had begun to consider the unthinkable. Maybe she should leave the city. Maybe she should leave her job. Maybe she should just try to disappear and start over somewhere else where no one knew her name and no accusations could follow. She shared this thought with Marcus one night, and his immediate response was, "No. Absolutely not. That means she wins." "Maybe she wins anyway," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe I just need to accept that someone has decided my life is the place where they're going to work out their pain, and the only way to stop it is to not be here to receive it." Marcus pulled her close. "We're not running. We're going to fight this. And we're going to win." But as he said it, he could feel something shifting in him too. This ordeal was changing them. The distance that had existed between them before, the quiet estrangement that had made him feel unseen, was being replaced by something different. They were bonded now, but the bond was trauma-based. It was the closeness of people in a foxhole together, not the closeness of people who had chosen each other freely. What neither of them knew was that Karen had already made her next move. And this move would change everything. Detective Morrison received the phone call at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night. The caller was male, and the caller was clearly in distress. "I need to tell you about what my ex-wife has been doing," the man said. "Her name is Karen Mitchell. She's been fabricating accusations against a woman named Sarah Chen. I know this because I helped her. I'm the private investigator she hired. And I'm done. I'm done being part of this, and I need to tell you everything." The PI's name was Robert Hartley, and what he provided over the course of the next 3 hours was a comprehensive documentation of Karen's campaign against Sarah. Emails, financial records, photographs of the materials Karen had prepared, bank transactions showing her hiring his services. He gave Morrison the timeline. He gave him the motivation as Karen had explained it to him. A stranger showed her kindness at a gas station, and Karen had decided that kindness was actually judgment, and that judgment needed to be reciprocated. She has a pattern, Robert said, and Morrison could hear the man's own guilt in his voice. I didn't see it at first. But the more I looked, the more I realized this isn't the first time she's done something like this. There are others. Women she worked with. A friend of a friend. She collects grievances and then she redirects them. She's very careful. Very deliberate. But once you see the pattern, it's obvious. By 3 a.m., Morrison had enough information to obtain a search warrant for Karen's apartment. By 6 a.m., officers were executing that warrant. What they found inside Karen's apartment was beyond what Morrison had prepared himself for. The notebooks. Hundreds of pages of detailed accounts of perceived slights, real and imagined injustices, names and dates and catalogued comments. Photographs of women, not just Sarah, but others. Articles clipped from newspapers. Financial records. Evidence of a mind that had organized its pain into a comprehensive mythology of victimhood and retribution. In the kitchen, they found a laptop. When the forensics team examined it, they found evidence of the emails, the Reddit posts, the false reports. And they found something else, a detailed plan for the next phase of Karen's campaign against Sarah, including research into legal ways to ensure that Sarah's name would appear in public records in a way that would cause permanent damage. By 8 a.m., Karen was being arrested. What happened next was not what Sarah and Marcus expected. They expected Karen to be charged with making a false report, stalking, harassment, breaking and entering. They expected the criminal justice system to process Karen and for some measure of justice to be served. They expected to finally be able to breathe. What they didn't expect was to receive a phone call from Diane saying that Karen had hired an attorney named Victor Russo, and that Russo was already filing motions. What kind of motions? Sarah asked. He's arguing mental health issues, Diane said. He's already had a preliminary psychiatric evaluation done, and he's going to argue that Karen is not competent to stand trial. That she needs psychiatric treatment, not incarceration. So what does that mean? Marcus asked, his voice tight. It means this case might not go to trial. It means he might get her a reduced sentence, or psychiatric commitment instead of prison time. It means the resolution you were expecting might not happen. Sarah felt something give way inside her. She'd been holding on to the idea that there would be accountability, that Karen would face consequences, that the system would right itself. The revelation that the system might do no such thing was almost worse than the original false accusations. What she didn't know was that Karen's attorney had already met with the district attorney and made a compelling argument. Karen was a woman with a diagnosed history of obsessive-compulsive disorder. She had paranoid thought patterns. She was on medication that hadn't been adjusted in 6 years. She had lost her job, lost her housing, lost her grip on reality. She needed mental health treatment, not punishment. And Victor Russo was very good at making sure that's what she got. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. And that's when something shifted in Sarah's understanding of how the world worked. She was sitting in a coffee shop when a woman approached her. The woman was elderly, with kind eyes and a determined expression. She introduced herself as Carol, and she said she was Karen's mother. I wanted to apologize, Carol said, her voice thick with tears. For what my daughter has done to you. She's very ill. Very, very ill. I've been trying to get her help for years. After the divorce, she just got worse. She couldn't hold down a job. She couldn't maintain relationships. She couldn't see reality anymore. And I know that's not an excuse for what she's done to you. But I wanted you to know that she's not a bad person. She's a sick person. And I think if you could find any compassion. Sarah cut her off, not unkindly. Your daughter broke into my home. She created a false accusation that resulted in me being taken to a police station. She harassed me and stalked me and told me that she had access to my life whenever she wanted. I'm glad she's getting help. I'm genuinely glad. But that compassion you're asking for, I don't have it. I'm too busy trying to remember how to feel safe in my own home. Carol's face crumpled. I understand. But she didn't hurt you. She absolutely hurt me, Sarah said quietly. And the fact that we might both survive what she did to me doesn't make it not hurt. But as she said it, Sarah understood the horrible calculus that was about to unfold. Karen was mentally ill. Karen needed help. And in a system that prioritized treatment over punishment, a mentally ill person who had systematically dismantled another person's life might walk away with consequences far less severe than the damage she'd caused. By the time of the preliminary hearing, the narrative had shifted entirely. Karen was now positioned as the victim, a victim of mental illness, of circumstance, of a system that hadn't helped her enough. The judge listened to testimony from a psychiatrist about Karen's OCD, her paranoid ideation, her medication noncompliance. The judge listened to Victor Russo argue for psychiatric treatment. And the judge, a compassionate man who was genuinely moved by Karen's mental health history, agreed. Karen was ordered to undergo psychiatric evaluation and treatment instead of standing trial. She was released to an outpatient mental health program. Her dangerous behavior was to be managed through therapy and medication, not incarceration. Sarah watched this unfold from the courtroom gallery, and she felt the ground shift beneath her. This wasn't about right and wrong. This wasn't about justice. This was about a system that was designed to help the guilty more effectively than it helped the innocent. Marcus squeezed her hand, but neither of them spoke. There were no words. What happened next was what Sarah would later think of as the moment everything became real. 2 days after the hearing, as Sarah left her office building, she was met by at least a dozen members of the press. They'd gotten wind of the story, a woman falsely accused, a victim of a mental health crisis, a story with all the right elements to be sympathetic to Karen. Do you think the justice system failed Karen Mitchell? One reporter asked. How do you feel about the reduced consequences? Another called out. Do you believe people with mental illness should be held accountable for their actions? A third added. Sarah stood there in the afternoon sunlight with her colleagues watching from inside the building, and she understood that she'd become the villain in someone else's narrative. She was the woman who'd shown kindness to someone in crisis, but now she was the unforgiving victim, the person who wanted to punish a mentally ill woman. By that evening, the news cycle had determined the angle: woman's false accusation reveals need for better mental health support. The story was sympathetic to Karen. The story was compassionate to Karen. The story, by necessity, positioned Sarah as the unforgiving beneficiary of a system that prioritized her safety over Karen's wellness. And Sarah understood, in that moment, that she'd lost something fundamental: the right to her own story. 6 months later, Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot of the Shell station on Birch Street. She'd driven here specifically to return to the beginning, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe she thought that if she could go back to the moment before the false accusation, before the harassment, before the entire machinery of chaos had been set in motion, she could somehow undo it. Undo her kindness. Undo her recognition of Karen's pain. The morning was similar to that morning 6 months ago: early light, the quiet promise of a day not yet corrupted by its contents. Sarah got out of the car and walked inside the station, not for coffee this time, but just to stand in the space where it had all begun. The cashier was different from the one who'd been there before. Sarah bought a bottle of water she didn't want and sat in the small seating area and tried to access the feeling of that original morning. She couldn't. It had been replaced by something harder, colder. What she couldn't know, what she would only discover later that afternoon, was that something was happening at the downtown police station at that exact moment. Karen had missed her psychiatric appointments for 3 weeks. She'd stopped taking her medication. She'd let her grip on the prescribed reality she'd been given slip away. And that morning, she'd gone to the downtown office building where Sarah worked and had attempted to confront her. What she hadn't expected was the security protocols that had been put in place specifically because of what she'd done before. Sarah's building had increased security. They had her photo flagged. And when Karen walked in with a small knife purchased at a pharmacy, the security guard had called police immediately. Karen had been arrested immediately. No incident. No violence. Just a woman making the same move again but encountering a system that was now prepared for her. And here's where the story twisted into irony so complete that it felt almost scripted. Detective Morrison, charged with escorting Karen from the building, had made a small gesture. When she was being taken into custody, when officers were placing her in the car, Morrison, recognizing her mental distress, recognizing the diminishment of her person, recognizing something in her that stirred his own human compassion, had rendered a small salute. It was meant as a gesture of respect for her humanity even in her pathology. It was meant to acknowledge that he understood she was not only her worst actions. It was meant as a kindness. But security footage from that building captured that salute. And somewhere along the chain of custody and trial preparation and plea negotiations, that footage made its way onto the internet. By the next morning, the story had pivoted again. Police officer honors woman being arrested for psychiatric crisis. The spin was that Morrison was acknowledging Karen's strength. That he was respecting her courage. That the system was finally seeing Karen as a person deserving of dignity. The footage didn't show Karen's criminality. It showed an officer's humanity. And the internet, with its infinite appetite for narratives of redemption and recognition, had reframed a moment of compassion as a moment of justice. Sarah saw the video while sitting at her desk at work. Someone had sent it to her with a note, "Thought you should see this." She watched the officer, a man she'd never seen before, render a small salute to Karen. And she understood, in that moment, that the story had completed its inversion. Karen, the woman who destroyed her life with false accusations and stalking and harassment, was now being positioned as the victim of a psychiatric crisis who deserved recognition and compassion. And Sarah, the woman who'd been falsely accused and traumatized and stalked, was positioned as the person who couldn't forgive. The person who couldn't show compassion to a mentally ill woman. Marcus found her at her desk and sat down beside her. "I know," he said quietly. "I saw it too." "It's not fair," Sarah said, and her voice was small. "No," Marcus agreed. "It's not. But fairness, they'd both learned, wasn't really a category that applied to how the world actually worked. The world didn't reward good intentions. It didn't punish bad ones consistently. It simply moved forward, driven by the narratives people constructed and shared, and the truth was often just noise underneath. Sarah took a leave of absence from work. She didn't go back. She and Marcus used their savings to move upstate, to a town where no one knew her name and no accusations could follow. She found work at a different accounting firm, doing similar work for less recognition and less advancement. It was enough. It had to be enough. But she never forgot the woman at the gas station. And she never forgot that moment of kindness, reaching out to someone in pain, acknowledging their suffering, offering a moment of human connection, had been used as a weapon against her. 2 years later, Sarah saw a news article about Karen. Karen had stabbed a woman at a grocery store. The stabbing had been unprovoked and had resulted in serious injury. This time, there was no conversation about mental health and compassion. This time, Karen was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 8 years in prison. Sarah read the article and felt nothing. No satisfaction. No vindication. Just the hollow understanding that if she'd simply ignored Karen at that gas station, if she'd been cold instead of kind, if she'd maintained the professional distance that most people maintained, then Karen would have remained invisible to her, and a woman in a grocery store would have remained unprepared for violence. That night, she told Marcus about the article. "She was sick," he said quietly. "What happened to that woman at the grocery store wasn't your fault." "I know," Sarah said. "But I also know that kindness to the wrong person, in the wrong moment, can have consequences you never see coming. And I don't know how to be in the world with that knowledge. I don't know how to extend kindness safely. I don't know if I ever will again. Marcus held her, and they sat in silence, understanding the thing that false accusations don't often capture: the victim isn't just violated by the accusation itself. The victim is violated by the knowledge that the system that's supposed to protect them can be weaponized so easily. That compassion can be mistaken for conspiracy. That kindness can be used as ammunition. Detective Morrison, watching the footage of Karen's conviction for attempted murder on the news, felt something settle in him. He understood, now, why he'd rendered that salute. It wasn't because he believed Karen was being wronged by the justice system. It was because he'd been trying to maintain his own humanity in a job that constantly tested it. He'd been trying to remind himself, and maybe trying to remind her, that people were more than their worst moments. But he would never know if that salute had helped anyone at all. He would never know if Karen had been moved by it or destroyed by it. He would only know that he tried, and that kindness and violence are sometimes indistinguishable until long after they've done their damage. In her prison cell, Karen thought about the woman at the gas station every single day. She thought about the moment Sarah had seen her pain and had tried to soothe it. And Karen had convinced herself that Sarah was trying to show her up, trying to demonstrate superiority, trying to position herself above Karen's suffering. And from that misunderstanding, everything had followed: the false accusation, the harassment, the stalking, the attempted murder of someone else who'd reminded her of Sarah's composed, unconcerned face as she'd walked back to her car. Karen had taken her pain and distributed it. She'd spread it around like contagion, and in doing so, she'd only confirmed what she'd come to believe: that kindness was a lie, that people were fundamentally selfish, that compassion was just another form of control. She would spend the next 8 years in prison, and she would tell anyone who would listen that she'd been trying to help Sarah see that the world wasn't as kind as Sarah pretended it was. She would frame her actions as some kind of awakening, some kind of teaching. And very few people would listen, and even fewer would believe her. But Karen would believe it. That was the tragedy and the madness of it. Karen would always believe that she was the victim, and that everyone else, the woman at the gas station, the woman at the grocery store, the system that had convicted her, were conspiring against her. And somewhere in her mythology, there was just enough truth mixed with delusion that she could almost convince herself that her version of events was correct. Sarah, however, would eventually find her way back to something resembling peace. Not by forgiving Karen, forgiveness felt like a betrayal of herself at this point, but by accepting that some damage couldn't be repaired. That some invasions couldn't be undone. That sometimes the best you could do was simply survive the aftermath and try to build something new on the wreckage. She would have a daughter 3 years later. And when that daughter asked her why she didn't want to go to the grocery store, or why she got nervous when people approached her, Sarah would have to find a way to explain that the world had taught her something hard about kindness. That sometimes, when you saw pain in someone's eyes and tried to help, you were just opening yourself to be hurt by that very pain. And that daughter would grow up understanding, at a cellular level, something about her mother's wariness. She would inherit that knowledge the way children inherit their parents' traumas, and she would spend her own life trying to unlearn it, trying to believe in kindness again, trying not to let one woman's broken heart prevent her from having one. The Shell station where it all began would eventually close. The building where Sarah's life had been interrogated would be renovated and sold to a different company. The police station where Karen had been arrested would update its equipment and its protocols and its understanding of mental health. And the world would move forward the way it always does, carrying these stories in its invisible weight, these moments of connection and betrayal, these instances where kindness and violence became so intertwined that they were impossible to separate. And if anyone had asked Officer Morrison about that salute, about why he'd rendered it, about what he meant by it, he would have said simply, "Because she's a human being, and I wanted to acknowledge that. I wanted to maintain my own humanity while doing my job. I wanted to believe that even in my small gesture, I could refuse to let this system dehumanize any of us." But the internet had decided his salute meant something else. And his intention, like so many intentions, had been lost in the translation between what was done and what was seen. And that, perhaps, is the final irony. In a world where everything is recorded and shared and interpreted, our actions matter far less than the stories people decide to tell about them. And if you show kindness to the wrong person, your intention becomes invisible, and your action becomes evidence of something you never intended at all. The woman at the quiet petrol pump had tried to help someone in pain. And in doing so, she'd learned that the world isn't always kind to people who are kind. That compassion can be mistaken for judgment. That recognition of suffering can be reinterpreted as some kind of superior witnessing. And she'd learned that sometimes, the salute people give you isn't respect for your humanity. It's just acknowledgement that they see you, and sometimes being seen is the most dangerous thing of all.